History Month. It's important now more than ever that we continue to tell the stories of people like Eliza so that we can understand the history of our communities and all the people who made those communities possible. As Andy was saying, I used to be the director of the Frank Museum here in town. I'm now a faculty member in the history department, but the genesis of this project goes back to when I was the director of the museum. So we're going to start by zipping back a little bit in time to learn about the life of Eliza Galloway, who was one of the very first African-American people to live in what is now Kearney, Nebraska. She moved here in the 1880s and lived here until her death in 1936. So we're going to be talking about her life here today. And I want to start us off by thinking a little bit about how the Frank Museum, when it was then called the Frank House, used to tell the story of Eliza Galloway. She has been incorporated into the story of the museum or the house for several decades as part of the tour you would receive if you visited and took a tour with oftentimes one of the student docents or tour guides there. So going back to 2014, I'm brand new to Kearney. I'd never heard of Kearney before I got the job at the Frank Museum. Never been to Nebraska before I came here for my job interview. Just beginning to learn about the community and its history, just beginning to learn who the Franks are, beginning to learn kind of what is the story at this house that I am now helping to curate and run. And about 3 weeks in, I'm sitting in my office on the second floor of the museum. In my office at the time, the house hadn't been renovated yet. That was one of my projects. My office at the time has two doorways into an adjoining interpreted servant's bedroom. And those doorways are separated by curtains. There's not even a door there. There's just a shower curtain in the gap to give me a little bit of privacy. And I'm sitting at my desk. I'm probably answering emails. I don't remember. And I hear one of my students who had just met come up to the second floor of the museum and start talking about this woman named Eliza, who is an African-American woman who worked for the Franks as a domestic servant. And I'm starting from that to kind of get a sense of how the museum has been telling her story. And I hear this student, very well-meaning student, go up and say, okay, so now we're entering Eliza Galloway's bedroom here on the second floor of the Frank home, and let me tell you about Eliza. Eliza was born in slavery somewhere back east. She was emancipated at the end of the Civil War. This is the way the story went. She's emancipated at the end of the Civil War. After her emancipation, at some point, she comes to Kearney. And there's various kind of ways that we tell this story, but what the traditional way of telling the story is at the museum at this point in time is that she had, after emancipation, moved to New York City. And in New York, in Manhattan, she's destitute, she has a couple children, and she's wandering Wall Street specifically. And she's looking through store windows, and as she's looking in these store windows, a man by the name of Augustus Frank, who's George Frank's brother and kind of co-conspirator on some of their work here in Kearney, a man named Augustus Frank approaches her and offers her a job in his household as a cook, which is just kind of a weird thing to do to a lady you're seeing looking into a shop window, but that's the story. So he approaches her, he offers her a job. He sends her to Le Cordon Bleu to become a trained chef. Okay, that's a fun fact. And then at some point, when his brother moves to Kearney and establishes his home here and begins engaging in land speculation and developing industry in Kearney, which is what the Franks were doing, Augustus tells Eliza, you should go to Kearney and work for my brother. And so he sends Eliza here to Kearney, where she works for George and Phoebe Frank. She at some point becomes the head of household through skill and hard work, I guess. She becomes the head of household and the chief of staff for the Franks' domestic staff. And they have 6 or 8 people working for them in various domestic capacities. She's so beloved by the family, the story goes, that she lives on the second floor in the only servant's bedroom on the second floor directly above the kitchen. And in fact, so beloved with them, one version of this I heard at one point was that the family allowed her to paint her bedroom her favorite color, which was pink. I don't know how we know her favorite color, but we'll get to that in a second. So she paints her bedroom pink. She later marries an African-American man here in Kearney, and the Franks, as a wedding gift, the story goes, give her her house over by Harmon Park. And then when the Franks go financially destitute, following the economic collapse in 1893, and are kind of leaving Kearney by the late 1890s. They supposedly give her all of their family china, and with that china, she starts specifically a catering business and runs that catering business in Kearney for the next 30 years, becoming the most prominent caterer in the community. This is a very grand story, but as a historian, it's my job to think about, how these stories fit within the context of their time, what seems realistic, and where is the source material to back all of this up, right? So I hear my student tell this story. I actually told her we're going to put a pause on that because some of those things sound a little weird to me, and we're going to look at what the sources in the archives say. We're going to try to figure out where is this all coming from, right? So, what are some things that we might want to question in that story? Augustus Frank fortuitously meeting her on Wall Street is an interesting tidbit. Why is she wandering down Wall Street specifically? Is that the only street we know of in New York City? Is that the one that just comes to mind when we think of New York? And this whole idea that he's approaching her in a shop window and offering her a job out of nowhere seems a little weird. So I'd love to see a little bit more on that. That she was trained at Le Cordon Bleu, that's a very specific kind of high-end chef training. I'd like to see some documentation or proof of that, right? That she was specifically sent to Kearney to work for George and Phoebe Frank. Theoretically, we should have some documentation as well to back that up. That she became the head of the household or the chief of staff. I heard it told a couple different ways. This would be remarkable for an African-American woman in this time, particularly because she would be the only African-American person on staff for the Frank family, which means that she would have been ordering around white staff, which would not be typically common in the late 1800s, right? So I would like to see something to back that up. That she lived on the second floor of the house and in a private bedroom which she had painted pink. Love to see why we know pink is her favorite color and where that comes from. That the Franks gave her a house as a wedding gift. There should theoretically be some property records or something backing that up, right? That she was given the Frank family china after the economic collapse and their bankruptcy, that as they are trying to make ends meet, as they are falling further and further in debt, they just decided to give this woman all of their family china. I'd like to see something backing that up. And presumably, if she owns a catering business, that there's some records of that, right? There's some announcements in the paper. There's some records in city directories indicating, Eliza Galloway's catering company out for hire, right? Something to that effect, right? So all of these are things that I'm hoping I'm going to find evidence of in the source material. Being a historian, I've got to go back to the original record, right? So I go to the original record. And the earlier curators of the Frank house were very diligent at photocopying and keeping records of all the things they were using to kind of piece together the story. And so there's a file on Eliza Galloway in the archives of the museum. And about 80% of that file is a series of letters from this lady named Rosina Stearns, written in the 1970s. Okay? It's not actually a lot of primary source material from the time period in the Frank Museum's collections. It becomes clear very quickly, as soon as I open that file, that most of the story is being pieced together from what Rosina Stearns wrote in a series of letters to the then director of the Frank House, Marion Johnson, who's pictured here in the upper right, in 1975. Okay? Eliza Galloway, I'm going to remind you, died in 1936. Okay? So one point of interjection here is we've got 40 years worth of memory going on. How many of you remember something very clearly from 40 years ago? How many of you remember a friend telling you about their life 40 years ago, right? Rosina Stearns was a teenager or a young adult kind of at the time in which she knew Eliza. They were associates of some sort in the 20s and 30s, but she was fairly young when she knew Eliza, and 40 years later contacted Marion Johnson to share what she knew about Eliza's story, okay? And this is where the origin and kind of the interpretation of the house seems to have come from. So we have this entry to the letter here where she says, "Dear Mrs. Johnson, I, as well I believe everyone who knew Eliza, had a real love for her, so I bear these memories I have written down, sound extravagant, and need careful sifting and discarding for the formal legend you need and will write for your purpose." It's fairly interesting that we're acknowledging here in 1975 we are creating a legend about Eliza Galloway. Not a history, a legend. All right? So we're creating a formal legend. If you think best, I feel Edna, by which she means Edna Baston Donald, who's another longtime Kearney resident, Edna, with her background of knowledge, would read and discard 9/10 of what I have written. So the source on which we are basing the story of Eliza Galloway is a woman saying, we're creating a legend, and I'm pretty sure 90% of this is wrong. Should pause for a second and not take all of that at face value, right? That's concerning. Liza would want to be remembered in her correctness and her dignity, which I think is a fair point, right? We want to remember people for who they actually were. Pictured here in the bottom left, right, by the way, this is Eliza standing with Rosina Stearns in her later years. All right, so let's look at a few little tidbits. I'm not going to highlight everything from these letters. There's several pages in length, but I want to highlight a few particular tidbits that maybe give us a sense of the seeds of some of this story, all right? So Liza was born in Maryland on an evidently large plantation, born into slavery. Right? Born on Maryland on an evidently large plantation, large because she talked of the numbers of help, both in the house and in the fields, and the many colored children. She did not know the date of her birth, but she thought she was younger than 10 when she saw her mother sold on the block to one of the bidders, and of course she never saw or heard from her again. So here we have evidence that Eliza was born into slavery, and that she, like many enslaved people, experienced family separation, that her mother was forcibly sold away when she was young to another plantation and never seen again. Right? This is a very common story we know in the history of enslavement in the United States. I do not know the name of the old Mars and the lady of the plantation. Frustrating point. I would love to know that name as a historian, right? I do not know the name, but Liza talked of them with great respect and affection, which is interesting. All went well on the plantation until old Mars died and the sons took over, using poor judgment and with extravagance became very much in debt and sold Liza's mother to pay their indebtedness a very large sum. So again, the story of family separation. But specifically here, we know that she had an older enslaver who died, and that sons inherited the plantation. That's part of this story. I want you to remember that little bit. We also see a little bit of a romanticization of slavery going on here, which continues, right? She often talked of the happy life on the plantation and the fine training and teaching of character she had. A white teacher taught all of the children together around the dining table in the big house, though Liza, feeling she didn't learn as well as the others, hid under the table, so she did not learn to read and write. Now, we know that Eliza Galloway was illiterate for the duration of her life. That is backed up by other documentary record we'll look at here in a minute. But the idea that she's hiding from a teacher, I'm not so sure about that. She is in Maryland, where it is legal, technically, to teach enslaved persons to read, but it is not socially acceptable. So, for example, Frederick Douglass, who lived in Baltimore, was briefly taught a little bit of reading by his mistress before becoming more self-taught. So there's a possibility of this, but there's also, happy life on the plantation, the same plantation where they sold your mother away. These things aren't quite lining up, right? So again, a little bit of things to be suspect about in these recollections. Liza, in her late teens, married an older man on the plantation, so she had a marriage here, supposedly, and they went to New York to live. Maybe that's Manhattan. They went to New York to live. He died early, leaving Liza with two small girls, who, in Liza's words, died in the pest house with smallpox. So she had a first husband, who had passed away, and two children who had passed away before she came to Kearney. Right? That's not part of the way the story was being interpreted, but it is held up in this document. And then she often told of one Sunday morning with no food in the house. They had gone out to look in the windows. A fine-looking white man, not Augustus Frank, a fine-looking white man approached her and asked her, could she wash his fine shirts? Again, a very weird interaction. She's looking in shop windows and some guy walks up to her and says, hey, excuse me, can you wash my shirts? That doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that's what Rosina is recalling here. She could and would and continued until after the little girls died, when he asked her to join his household, and it was there she learned her fine cooking under what she said was a famous chef. All right, and coming to Nebraska. When the news of the marvelous development in Nebraska reached them and Liza was interested, the man encouraged her to go, so again, still unnamed, and so she and a friend left. On the train, her friend made a contact and took a position, but Eliza continued on, and I believe almost went immediately to the Franks, they're finally mentioned here, to live in, to be a domestic live-in, where she stayed until they went back to New York. They had a sale where fine furniture, art objects, and antiques were sold. Lesser things were given away, some to Eliza. So we can see the roots here, again, of some of these ideas. And I think this is my last one here. Early after Eliza came, she married what she called my husband Galloway, who was a Pullman porter on the Union Pacific. They built and established a fine little home near Third Ward Park, built and established, not gave to them, built and established a fine little home near Third Ward Park with lovely garden trees and happiness until he died of TB, tuberculosis. As to your question about Eliza's position in the household as in the Franks, mayor domo comes to mind, but you, Miss Johnson, will have a more graceful word, although because of her unique ability, she did become a person in charge, one of the definitions given in the dictionary. So Rosina Stearns is looking at a dictionary in 1975 and says, that sounds about right. I think that's probably what her job was. All right. So we go back to some of the things we should question. There's nothing in the documentary record that says she met Augustus Frank on Wall Street. There's no mention of Wall Street. There's no mention of Augustus Frank. There's nothing indicating she trained at Le Cordon Bleu. It says she trained supposedly under a famous chef, but this gets extrapolated to Le Cordon Bleu. And again, we're already dealing with a recollection in 1975 that we should be suspect of too. Sent to Kearney to work with George and Phoebe Frank. Not necessarily the way it's spelled out in any of the source material we had. Head of household and chief of staff, quite clearly a guess coming from a woman in 1975 recalling what Eliza's role might have been. That she lived in the house, possibly indicated by the source material, but no mention of her living specifically in the second floor bedroom or of her favorite color being pink. That the Franks gave her a house as a wedding gift seems to be contradicted by the letter, which says that she and her husband built their home over near Harmon Park, 518 West 20th. That she was given the Frank family china after an economic collapse. It says that they gave her lesser things, not the family china. And no mention of her running a business catering in town. Right? All right, so all of that kind of drops off. All of that seems a little bit suspect to my eyes as a historian, and I think what we have instead is a very grand example of the time. Right? We have an individual remembering what she recalled Eliza telling her 40 years earlier, and then we have a museum that at no point had any kind of formal tour brochure or like tour training materials for the student staff. And so students are telling students who are telling students who are telling students, and the story's just getting better and better as it goes on. Right? So we need to rein that in. We got to back stuff up with source material. That's our go-to as historians, right? So what do? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to all the traditional source material you're going to go to find genealogical records, right? Try to find them in, let's say, the census records, right? Now, those of you who do genealogical research know that one of the big disappointments in doing genealogy, especially in Kearney in the late 1800s, is that the 1890 census does not exist. It was destroyed in a fire. So we lose a lot of valuable record there, in particular because 1890 is kind of the heyday of early Kearney and the heyday of the Frank family's time in Kearney. So if she lived within the Frank home as a domestic, it would have been indicated in the 1890 census when they lived in that house. But that census doesn't exist, so I don't have that record and I can't do anything about that. But we can look at the 1900 census record. And the 1900 census record gives us, oops, I didn't mean to click next here. Sorry about that. The 1900 census record gives us Eliza Galloway living with James Galloway, her husband, who's mentioned in Rosina Stearns' letter. They are living at 518 West 28th Street. That's this house right here. It still stands today. This is Eliza pictured, I believe, in the backyard of the house in her garden. James is described as the head of household. Eliza is his wife. He is born in 1850. She is born, and this is probably a guess, but in 1855. So would have been about 5 years old, 6 years old when the Civil War started, and about 10 when the war ended. He is born and from Virginia, as well as his parents. She is born in Maryland, and her parents are from Maryland, so lining up with some of the things we see in Rosina's letter. And he is described as a Pullman porter conductor, lining up with Rosina's letter. And she is a laundress. This is 1900. The Franks are gone. She's not a caterer. She's a laundress, per the census record. Okay? She's a laundress. And then lastly here, this OFH means that they own freely, as in it's paid off, it's not mortgaged, a house. Okay? So they own freely this home. Okay? Interestingly, they also have a third person living with them. A man by the name of John Logan, who is an 18-year-old African-American male born in Nebraska, whose parents came from Missouri and Tennessee, and is a waiter. He is a boarder living in their home. So there is an African-American man who had moved to Kearney, was looking for a place to live, and Eliza and James Galloway provided a room in their house for him to reside in while he was working as a waiter here in town, boarding with them, possibly because he couldn't find other places to stay in town. Okay. We look at marriage licenses, and there are two for Eliza Galloway. This is where our County Historical Society becomes really helpful, right? And some of the records at the Frank Museum too. But the County Historical Society really key here, as well as Ancestry.com. On the left, we have her marriage license to James Galloway. Okay? There's a few interesting things here. She's named as Eliza Riley, R-I-L-E-Y. So is Riley the name of her first husband, or is it the name of her enslaver? We don't quite know off of this necessarily, but we have indication of a prior name, right? She is, at the time of this marriage license, which is in March of 1893, described as being 37 years old. She lives in Kearney along with her husband, but has unknown father name and unknown mother's name, not uncommon for somebody born enslaved, who had their parents separated from them at a young age. And very frustratingly, initially at least, described as being born in Hancock, Nebraska, which doesn't exist, but gets clarified in her second marriage license. And now we know there's another individual that she marries in the 1920s. This is a marriage between Eliza Galloway and a man named Frank Red, who is also an African-American man living here in Kearney. He is from Pensacola, Florida, close to where I grew up. Has a little bit of information about his family, and we see that Eliza is not from Hancock, Nebraska. She's from Hancock, Maryland. Hancock is a town in Maryland. Okay, that's interesting. And she gives us names for a father and mother here, which I have frustratingly not been able to figure anything out from. Berger Sprigg is what she gives as her father's name, and her mother's name is given as Bozeman. Fortunately, I haven't yet found anything off of that. We can also look at the last will and testament for both James and Eliza Galloway for a little bit of information here. So on the left, we have James Galloway's will. This is issued in 1904, a year before his death from tuberculosis, and says that he is leaving his property and all of his assets, so his property at the Lot 5 and Block 39 of the Perkins and Hartford's edition, which is 518 West 28th Street, to his wife, Eliza Galloway, and he is signing with his mark, indicating that he was probably not literate, couldn't sign his own name. Okay. And then over here, we have Eliza's will, which is signed in 1926, about 10 years before her passing. It is also signed with her mark, indicating again that she was illiterate, and is leaving a lot of her estate to some of James's nieces. It includes a couple interesting lines in here. It talks about her wishes to be buried in the Kearney Cemetery and to have flowers laid on her grave every Decoration Day. Actually includes a stipend, essentially, to help underwrite that. And goes on to say that I give to my husband, her third husband, Frank Red, provided that he is living with me at the time of my death, such a portion of my estate as the statutes of the state of Nebraska would give to him should he demand it and no more. Which is kind of interesting. She, we know, will, soon after signing this will, get divorced from Frank Red and go back to being Eliza Galloway, and will be buried when she dies in the Kearney Cemetery as Eliza Galloway. So I'm sure there's a story there in her third marriage to unpack. And so we know she dies in the 1930s. That's right in the middle of the New Deal, and there are some New Deal records that also give us a little bit of a glimpse into her life that I think is pertinent here. On the left here, we have a federal emergency relief application from Eliza Galloway, which again describes her husband as James Galloway. Doesn't even mention Frank anymore. He's gone. They're divorced. She doesn't care about it. James Galloway gets mentioned as deceased. Eliza gives her former married name as Spriggs, not Riley, which again adds layers of confusion to all of this. And we see from the accompanying documentation some evidence that Eliza, by 1935, the year before her death, is struggling financially, like a lot of people in Kearney. So she has a lawyer who's calling in on her behalf, requesting assistance for fuel and food aid for her. She's probably about 89, 90 years old at this point, living by herself. She gets issued some coal by the government in October of 1935, gets a home visit in December of that year, where it includes this interesting little note saying that she sold some old rare pieces of silver in China for a little cash, which will enable to supply her own fuel for a while. So if she did inherit some family china, perhaps she sold it off to pay her own debts later in life. And we know she dies in 1936 in Good Samaritan Hospital here in town. And the nuns at Good Samaritan do record a little bit about her. In January, shortly after being admitted to the hospital, she spends a couple months in the hospital. Shortly after being admitted to the hospital, the nuns record this about Eliza Galloway, saying that Eliza was an old negress, well over 90 years of age, and admitted to the hospital. She had been a field slave and distinctly recalls her slavery days, how her father and mother had been separated, further corroborating that story, because they had been sold to different masters, how she saw her mother put up and sold at auction, further corroborating Rosina's recollections on that point, and she declares that the cruelties described in Uncle Tom's Cabin are not exaggerated. She well remembers the emancipation when President Lincoln freed the slaves. Okay, so maybe life on the plantation wasn't always great when she is telling the nuns at Good Sam in 1936 that the cruelties of Uncle Tom's Cabin were not an exaggeration. She's recalling a far harsher existence than Rosina Stearns is necessarily remembering 40 years later. Because Eliza was one of the only African-American residents of the community, her passing is also heavily reported on in the Kearney Hub. There are multiple articles about her being hospitalized and her ultimate death. She would have been considered a kind of notable individual because of the uniqueness of being one of the only black members of the community. So this article comes from February of 1936 and includes a few interesting little tidbits for us, saying that in the dim past, Eliza had changed the panties on literally dozens of Kearney's now prominent businessmen, and years later she baked their wedding cakes and still later cared for their children. That is the description of a domestic servant. That is not the description of a catering business owner. That is the description of a domestic servant, somebody who changed diapers, who baked wedding cakes, and who cared for children. She was presumably by this point taking care of the children of numerous kind of prominent folks, not necessarily living in anybody's individual house, but going around to different homes and helping to take care of their kids and cook meals and those sorts of things. Fairly common domestic servant role in the early 1900s. Not just in Kearney, really anywhere in the US. She never intended to come to Kearney. That's a fun one. Not sent to Kearney, didn't want to come to Kearney is the story here. At the Midway Hotel, she met James Galloway. He conducted a nifty shining stand at the hotel. Romance called, and they enjoyed many happily years of wedded life. Some more about James here and how they met at the Midway, that he maybe was also a bootblack at the hotel, and that they were happily wedded. But again, no mention of Frank. It just gets kind of forgotten about. And her home, a modest but neat residence at 518 West 28th Street, was paid for long ago by her savings, not gifted to her by the Frank family. Paid for long ago by her savings, corroborated possibly by that census record that shows that she and James freely owned their home. We also have this letter from March of 1936, where a guy named K.A. Hanote, who lived in Kearney in the 1890s and knew Eliza, wrote to the Kearney Hub with his recollections of what he remembered of her life, and then the Hub just published his letter, because that's what you do. And so he says, I know Eliza cannot read, but whoever is kind enough to read this note to her, I hope will also be good enough to drop me just a word, so more validation of the idea that she was probably illiterate for the duration of her life. And I always thought more of you and Jim, so this is him writing to Eliza, you and Jim, by which I mean Mr. Galloway, than you ever knew. Of course, I was young and full of the old Nick when I met Jim at the Midway, and through him I met you. At the time, you was known as Mrs. Riley, so that name has come back to us, and was working for the Franks that lived just west of town. Incidentally, this is the only document contemporary to Eliza Galloway's life that indicates she ever worked for the Franks. There's nothing in census records, there's nothing in the newspaper, there's nothing in city directories, there's literally nothing except that indicates that she works for the Franks. Nothing about her living on the upper floor, nothing about her having a favorite room, or anything to that effect from the time period in which she was living. Okay? That's important, right? And we also know from just kind of traditional research that there are some parts of this story that are missing. Right? Frank Red gets dropped off, almost never mentioned in any of these recollections. And James, her second husband, who she is buried next to in the Kearney Cemetery, and adjacent to a tombstone where their last name is still misspelled to this day. Right? James dies earlier than her by about 30 years in the Hastings Insane Asylum. That part wasn't part of the story either. James is arrested in 1903, in August of 1903, here in Kearney. He is tried and convicted of insanity and incarcerated at the State Insane Asylum, where he dies of tuberculosis 2 years later. The accusation of insanity has to do with this comment here. I'm still working to be full disclosure on this. Still working to try to figure out exactly what has happened in 1903, what happened. There should be somewhere, if they haven't been destroyed, Insane Commission records that if anybody can find, I would love to look at, because there's a county Insane Commission that heard this case. I'm also trying to get access to the records of the State Insane Asylum that are at the State Historical Society. That's a complicated process. So for now, what I have is what the newspaper reports on, which is sometimes questionable at best. But here it says, today, James started around town trying to borrow money from different merchants, but did not have much success. No reason as to why merchants aren't loaning him money. But merchants aren't loaning him any money. He then went round to the different stores and purchased a miscellaneous assortment of different things. Seems fairly normal. He had a gun with him, and he threatened to kill a prominent businessman, imagining that he had wronged him, so the officers concluded it best to take care of him. So he possibly threatened a businessman with a gun, but instead of kind of going through the traditional judicial system, as we know, insane asylums are used in this time against women and people of color for small kind of discretions and social, kind of stepping outside of the social norms. He is sent to the State Insane Commission, deemed insane, and incarcerated for the rest of his life in the State Insane Asylum for this incident, okay? And then passes away and is buried here in Kearney. If we were to go back to that will, that last will and testament of James Galloway, it's signed in 1904, the witnesses to the will are doctors at the State Insane Asylum. So he's incarcerated when he is doing his will. But then the traditional research kind of runs out. We look at city directories. I've got one here that talks about Eliza living here in Kearney as a widow. This is from shortly after James dies. She's listed as African American, a widow of James, residing at 518 West 28th. You're welcome to come and look at this at some point. We've got the probate records for James Galloway, right? So this is where we have James Galloway's will. This is where we have other things related to what James Galloway possessed at the time of his death and feeding all of that material over to Eliza. We've looked at census records, we've looked at marriage licenses, we've done all the kind of traditional things that we can do as historians when we're trying to trace genealogy, right? But there's one thing that I don't have anything of, which is a single record that is in Eliza's voice where Eliza is telling me her own story, right? And she is not literate as far as we know, so it's not surprising that I don't have any letters, I don't have a diary, I don't have anything in her voice. That changed relatively recently when I picked this project up again a couple years ago in my new position at the university and hopped on newspapers.com and started looking around for documentation kind of on how the museum had been interpreting her life in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I wanted to kind of see how the story was evolving as the newspaper was doing Black History Month programs and how they were reporting on who Eliza Galloway was. And one of the things I came across, because now the more recent issues of the Hub are up on newspapers.com, they weren't 10 years ago, is this mention of this woman, Helen Kendall Jensen, retiring from her work at the Kearney Hub, with this little aside, just drop in here, that says the Hub had already published some of her Echo stories. You all know the Echo is the high school newspaper. The Hub had already published some of her Echo stories, including an interview with a local Black woman, Eliza Galloway, who had been a slave as a child. Okay? So we came running over here to BCHS. Our County Historical Society, bless them, has a smattering of issues of the Echo from that time period. They do not have all of the issues. But thankfully, they have that issue. And that's this last issue here. It's this last document, which you're welcome to come and look at. This is from April of 1928. This is long before the professionalization of oral history. This is long before the WPA slave narratives of the 1930s, which Eliza was never interviewed as part of, although there is a small record on her in there. This is remarkable work by our local high school journalist, and someplace I would never have looked for documentation on Eliza Galloway. Okay? It is a 2-column interview, or 1.5, I guess, 1.5 column interview with what they call Aunt Elsa. It's a high school newspaper, so they misspelled her name. Aunt Elsa Galloway read, telling of her early life. And I want to just highlight a few interesting things here, all right? She says, I was born at Hancock, Maryland. That's the first thing I get out of her voice in the document. I was born in Hancock, Maryland, a place between the Potomac River and Virginia. My mother belonged to a man named Jacob Ligle. My father belonged to another man and lived 10 miles away, but every Saturday night he was allowed to come and see my mother. Conjugal visits, not uncommon in this time period. My mother was a very good woman, and when a man from Alabama offered my master a great deal of money for her, he sold her. We have Eliza talking about her family being separated now. That hits more powerfully. My father never knew about it until he came the next Saturday night and found her gone. Right? Forced separation from his spouse. All the colored children on the plantation were put in one cabin together. The older folks were made to work at the house. Nobody who hasn't seen it can understand how awful it was. Not it was great, but it was awful, right? Which lines up with more of our understanding. Hancock, Maryland becomes an interesting point now. I've got it in a marriage license. I've got it in Eliza's recollection. This is the town of Hancock. It is in the tiny little spit of Maryland out in western Maryland. The thinnest little part, if you're picturing Maryland in your head. When it's a mile or two wide, that's where Hancock is, okay? This is an excerpt from an 1860s property map, kind of an atlas map of Hancock, Maryland, Washington County, Maryland, where Hancock is located. And it has all of the adjoining property owners named out here. Now, there is no Ligle. That's frustrating. There's a Tammy, there's a Carter, there's a Reel, there's a Snively, but there's a Schlegel. And that phonetically is semi-close, and interestingly enough, the first initial is a J. And then she said Jacob, which, that's a memorable name, Jacob Ligle. Could that be J. Schlegel? We go to the census records, and we find a slave schedule for 1860 or thereabouts. This is where the census is recording the enslaved people on different plantations in Maryland. And we see a John and Jacob Schlegel, so we get Jacob Schlegel here, who have enslaved about 7 or 8 people here, 2 of which are an 8 and 10-year-old girls, which lines up about with how old Eliza Galloway would have been in 1860. Okay? And if I jump back here, I'm going to point out again, this is J. Schlegel's heirs, which is John Jacob Schlegel. So I went to Washington County, Maryland, where I pulled the records for Jacob Schlegel, the father of John and Jacob, who died in 1857. And as part of his death, there's a property inventory, and on that property inventory, as would be traditional in the 1850s, are the names and valuations of all of his enslaved people. And on that list is a girl named Eliza, who's valued at $400. So this is an 1857 record, almost certainly of Eliza Galloway, being enslaved by Jacob Schlegel. And if we remember from those earlier records, there's a little bit of indication that there was an original enslaver who died and that his sons had inherited Eliza through that process. That's what we see going on in these records. Returning to her own life, she continued, in the war, my fathers went off with a bunch of soldiers. Afterwards, he heard of my mother down in Alabama and went to her. We heard from them until the big flood down in Alabama, but that was the last we knew of them. This is a story of family reunification, or an effort at that, which is a big part of the freedmen experience in the United States after the war, trying to find your family members who had been separated from you. Her father goes off with the soldiers. I really wish I knew more about what goes off with the soldiers mean. He could have possibly become a member of the U.S. colored troops. But regardless of that, after the war, he goes down to Alabama and finds supposedly his former wife until they lose contact with him during a big flood, which we suspect is probably the Great Flood in 1886 in Montgomery, which killed quite a number of people in Montgomery, Alabama. And then in the aftermath of the war, she talks about going to visit her aunt and uncle in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where there's a little bit of discussion about how her uncle had learned to read and write, and maybe this is where some of the Rosina Stern's kind of muddy recollections come from. And she goes on to say, when I was 18, I married a man named Mr. Riley and moved to Jersey City. There I had 2 daughters. One of them died when she was 5 years old, and the other lived to be 17 and then died of smallpox. Okay. Corroborating again a little bit, some portions of what is in that letter from Rosina Stern's. We see Riley mentioned again here, but now we know exactly where they lived. Jersey City. And so we can pull up census records for Jersey City, New Jersey. This one's hard to see because the record is very faded. This is Mr. Riley. This is John Riley with Eliza, as an African-American woman living with him in Jersey City at 357 West 4th Street, which is that building today. He is a railroad clerk, and she is listed as keeping home. And in their household is a 10-year-old girl named Annie, which is her daughter, who presumably is the one that dies of smallpox, who is attending school, according to the census. Okay? And around the corner from her is this guy, Jacob Long. You should go back, I think I missed that part. After Mr. Riley's death, I worked for a man named Isaac Long. We have Isaac Long here, who lives about 3 blocks away from where the Rileys live, and is an egg dealer, which is a fun job. He is an egg dealer in Jersey City, New Jersey. Presumably the individual who she worked for. She goes on to say, after talking about Isaac Long, that we kept hearing about how you could pick up gold on the streets of California. Again, she didn't want to come to Nebraska. So after a few years, a Scotch woman named Mary Jensen and I bought tickets and started out to California. On the train, we met Mr. Judd and Mr. Farty. Both these men were prominent during Kearney's boom. They told us to stop at Kearney instead of going to California, and they could get lots of work for us. But we had paid our tickets to California, and we didn't want to waste our money. They said they could sell our tickets easily enough for us, though, so we decided to stay at Kearney. Not George Frank sent me, not Augustus saw me staring into a window and sent me to become a chef and then sent me out to be with his brother. No, we heard about California, my friend and I, the Scottish immigrant lady, we bought tickets and we thought we'd go to California, and then some guys convinced us to stop here and said they'd pay for it. That's how they ended up there, right? In Kearney, I worked for Mr. Martin, who was later the editor of a magazine. Then I met Mr. Galloway. We were married and went to Hot Springs. We left our things in the Midway Hotel, and they burned up when the fire came, when the Midway Hotel burned to the ground. Right? After a while, we came back to Kearney and built this house. We built this house. We built this house. And there were no homes for blocks around here then, and all the land was grown up in sunflowers. So we can, look at some of this. E.M. Judd, Mr. Judd, is the president of the Midway Land Company. He's one of the big land speculators here. Would have known the Franks, would have been associated with them. This is probably how she gets involved in that network. Dr. O.S. Martin is the editor of a magazine, that's true. He's the editor of a magazine called Success Magazine. He is also the proprietor of the Midway Hotel, a little fact that she left out. The Midway Hotel, where James Galloway worked as a bootboy, and where all their stuff was stored when the hotel burned to the ground. Mary Jensen shows up in the newspapers. Never would have thought anything of this had I not had the oral history. Mary Jensen of Hot Springs, South Dakota, the place where James and Eliza Galloway went on their honeymoon. The Scottish lady comes back to visit Mrs. James Galloway, coming back to visit Eliza. So friendship with the Scottish woman who moved to Hot Springs, South Dakota, but where they decided to go spend their honeymoon, and who came down at least once to visit with Eliza later in life. We also get a sense of Eliza as being a more traveled woman. She's not just a domestic servant for the Frank family. A couple of these little snippets here. This one talks about her being at the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. This is actually not her voice. This is the high school journalist, noting that there's a picture in her house of herself and Mr. Riley taken on the day the Brooklyn Bridge opened. I would love to find that photograph. Right? After Mr. Galloway died, I went to California, but I didn't like it a bit out there. I went back home to Maryland too, but I didn't like it there either. So she traveled a little bit back and forth, didn't like either coast, decided to come back to Nebraska. I lived here in Kearney for 42 years now, but during that time I've been to Canada and traveled all around. I like Kearney best. That's kind of nice. And then another interesting keepsake, again, this isn't the voice of the journalist, was a necktie made of finely spun glass woven together. This had come from the Chicago Exposition. She went to the Chicago World's Fair in 1993. Right? She went to California, she went to Canada, she went to Maryland, she went to the Chicago World's Fair. More well-traveled woman than we were necessarily interpreting her as. We also get a little bit of a sense of the black community in Kearney that she would have been a part of. She says here there used to be 8 colored families in town, but now there's only 1, and they're planning to move away. And then with ringing endorsement says, I guess I'll stay here till they haul me out. Why are all these families leaving? There were 8 black families in Kearney, but they're all leaving, and the last one is getting ready to leave, right? Wonder what is causing that. That maybe helps to explain our black border in the census records. If we go back and look more closely at things like her marriage license, we see that witnesses to her marriage license are black residents of Grand Island who run the local Black Masonic Lodge. So she's part of a network of African Americans living in the kind of the Tri-Cities region in this time period. But that network is in decline. And it's actually 1 year after she records this interview with our Kearney hub, or our Kearney high school journalist, that there's a race riot in North Platte that results in about 200 African Americans in North Platte being chased out of town. Right? So there's rising Klan activity in this part of the country in the 1920s. There's rising anti-black sentiment in this part of the country in the 1920s. That is almost certainly part of why so many of those families had left. And we know that's why a large chunk of the African American community of North Platte left a year later. So there's more to this story too here. So I kind of want to wrap up here just thinking about who Eliza Galloway is then, right? We have this really romanticized story that the Frank Museum was telling about her, a story that's not particularly backed up by the historical record at all. And it's our job as historians to make sure that we back up everything we say. And so in digging through this a lot more, we realize one thing is the limitations of traditional records. I think in large part, this is a story of the power of the voices of people being preserved. The power of oral history. If I could only rely, if I only had the opportunity to rely on the traditional records, I never would have figured out where in Maryland she was enslaved. I never would have figured out who her enslaver was. I never would have learned half of what I know about her life had her voice not been recorded at some point. Right? That's part of the power, I think, of this story. And if we go back to Rosina, one line I very much so agree with her on, which is Eliza would want to be remembered in her correctness and her dignity. This is a story about how do we remember people correctly and accurately? How do we not overly romanticize their stories? How do we deal with all the messiness of history and the reality of who people are? That's kind of what I want to leave us with, and I've got like a little while for questions. Thank you all.
Was there an obituary written?
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the documents that I have pulled out.
Since her husband was at the insane asylum in Hastings,
Mhm.
I wonder what precipitated him being brought back to Kearney, because the insane asylum had their own cemetery, and I would think there would have to be money somewhere to bring his body back and buried in Kearney.
It's possible, and that's one of those things that I'd love to get more into the records of the Hastings Insane Asylum to see if there's any indication as to why he was sent back here. I mean, I imagine he's still married to Eliza, so there is a next of kin who can claim him, and oftentimes those kinds of cemeteries are more for people who cannot be claimed. So I wonder if that's part of that reason. But yeah, it's a good question.
Is there still a pink room?
Okay, so the pink room. I didn't make a big deal. All right, so the pink room. So if you peel back the layers of paint in that room, there is pink on the wall. And there was a little bit of pink kind of shining through in some spots before we did some of the restoration. The problem is, does anybody know what else the Frank house was used for? It was a hospital. The hospital painted, because we have the photographs from the hospital era, the hospital painted every room in the house either pastel pink, pastel green, or pastel blue. And those rooms were painted pastel pink. I I have photographs of them when they were an apartment in the 1960s. They're painted pastel pink. So the pink does exist on the wall, but that part wasn't made up. What was made up was the connection to Eliza. It's a connection to the hospital. And then from there, somehow it becomes it's her favorite color. I don't know where that comes from. But it's again one of those things where there's a seed of evidence, but we read like 7 layers of meaning into it that aren't actually there.
The documentation that you have from the nuns at the hospital, is that something they continued into like our contemporary days? Because I've been there for a lot of things, and I'm wondering, do they have records of me on there like that?
Probably not
How did you
that
find
recently.
that?
It's in the museum archives. Yeah, it's some record book they must have over there.
Wow.
There's just a little copy of that in the museum archives.
Well, now they wouldn't do it because of HIPAA,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
wow.
I mean, that's a different time for Good Sam too, right? Like Good Sam is very much so run by the nuns in 1936, right?
Yeah.
It's just operating a little bit differently than it does today as part of CHI and all of that, so.
1980s and 1990s, they were also.
Yeah.
That was before HIPAA.
My family has a picture of a wedding in 1921 at a 2-story house about a block east of Mona.
Mhm.
And it's a huge picture with a lot of people, and in the very background, his Aunt Mary had written that the black lady helped serve the wedding dinner. And I have always thought it was her,
It could be.
but you said there were 8 other families here.
Yeah, I mean, it could be her. That is one of the things she becomes known for. I think, she is catering for meals, right? So there's one of the records related to kind of the time when around the time she passes away.
Possibly have been.
Yeah.
I had the picture laid out to bring, and it's still at home laid out.
Well, we'll have to get in touch because I would love to see that. But yeah, and
I'll make you a copy.
Yeah. I'd love to see that. In 1936, she's referred to in one of the newspapers as a Kearney cateress. And so she is known, again, you saw that one record for going to weddings and birthdays and those sorts of things and preparing food. It's again, that goes from cateress to catering business, which is a different thing. So she's being hired out to help with
But it
people's
was,
weddings.
I thought it was unusual that she would have been in the
Yeah.
wedding pictures,
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
I mean, you can't make out her face very well.
Yeah.
Well, my best is written.
Just the importance of writing your story down. I know
Oh, yeah.
Eliza was illiterate, she could not write it down. I personally, I have 3 sons. My husband and 3 sons. Would they be able to tell my story after my death? Probably not. It's like they make up things. It's like, oh, that was not, I wrote my own obituary. Just to give them a starting point. Because they really, once you are deceased, what are they gonna write about you? I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's true. They wouldn't know dates and locations.
Right, so I think we all need to be able to write our story down and preserve that story. And I kind of gave my family a little bit story.
Well, and I think what's interesting with her too is when you get a chance to tell your own story, as she did in 1928, you focus on the things that matter to you. And so she's focusing on stuff that nobody else had considered important. She's talking about her family being separated. She's talking about her staying in touch with her father and her mother somehow, and kind of keeping track of that family until they passed away. She's getting a chance to kind of tell the story the way she would like to tell it, rather than the way people would like to tell it before her, and I think that's really important. I think it's also interesting, I didn't highlight this, but in that entire interview, the name Frank never shows up. She never mentions the Frank family at all. Doesn't mean she didn't work for him, I think she did, but she never mentions the family.
Hey, this is a little off topic, and it's kind of something I like. Can you go back a couple frames to the newspaper? Right, yeah,
This one?
right there. Now, it says fear polls down at sea, just below that, does that say reared boy as a girl until he reached 19?
Yeah.
Okay, one of my favorite things that's awesome is you should read old newspapers, because if you think things are crazy today, you need to read the old newspapers and go, oh, things aren't so bad maybe after all. And when you get into those, it's like a dog and a squirrel. I look for something and I see those things and I'm off to the races going,
You can lose a lot of time in Old Navy.
yes, for sure, they're entertaining.
You know how many years, annually they planted flowers on
I don't.
Would there be like a florist?
I do know that Dr. Nathan Ty goes and puts flowers on her grave every decoration day. Because it is in her. But I don't think that continued. I think that he picked that back up.
So, did they have any kids? Or?
So no. Yeah, so she has, as far as I know, only 2 children, and those are the 2 that pass away before she moves to Kearney. Never has any children with James by any record, and never has any children with Frank. She would have probably been too old at that point. But yeah, no lineal descendants, nothing to that effect. Yeah.
Is there a lead? I know early on you mentioned how there was an 18-year-old African-American,
The border.
the border, yeah. Is there a lead on that at all?
One that I need to chase, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's absolutely a story there. And that's, as I said, this is kind of research in progress. So a huge part of what I need to do still is identify who are those other families that she talked about? Who's this guy? Where did he come from? And one of the things I really want to try to get a better picture of is kind of, there are African Americans living in Hastings and Grand Island and here. And it's very clear from some of the kind of social mentions in the newspaper, you know, the so-and-so's having dinner over at so-and-so's house. There are enough mentions of Eliza or James going to visit friends in Grand Island, going to visit friends in Hastings, to give a sense that there's kind of a very small but very closely networked together Black community between the Tri-Cities. And I really want to get into who those people were and what is that community like out in this rural part of the country in that time period. I don't know if this individual is a part of that or if he's just somebody passing through. That's entirely possible. I'd love to get into it more. I also want to get into, as I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of the official records that we do have, the things you overlook, the witnesses to the records, right? Those kinds of things. A lot of those folks are part of that community and are friends of theirs, right? Because they're coming to witness their marriage or they're coming to witness something. So I want to get into those names as well and try to piece out who these, you know, who their network of friends were in Kearney. Yeah.
That yellow house is right across the street from our house. Very historic neighborhood.
Is the border, did that border have a job, did you say?
He's listed as a waiter.
A waiter, okay.
Yeah.
Probably at Midway.
Probably at Midway.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was, yeah, probably Midway.
And what year again was that?
That's 1900.
Okay.
So it would have been the second Midway.
Where did the beautiful picture of Eliza come from in the white dress? That is pretty.
Oh, yeah.
She looks at Dana's.
That one's fun. That is not at the house. That's a fun one. That's a courtesy of Dr. Nathan Ty as well. Let me get to it here. So this is actually, if I remember correctly, so you can just kind of see the number up here. On the house, it's just blocked off. I think it's 512, if I remember correctly, something like that. It is not at her house. It's not at the Frank house. It is at the house on the Pioneer Park, okay? Pioneer Park, the house on the northeast corner of Pioneer Park, the southeast corner of that intersection. There's a large house there, it was up for sale a few years ago. It's a 3-story big home from that time. She worked in that house, and that is a photograph of her outside of the home. And the reason we have that and know that specific thing is this photograph of her actually comes from, I believe it's the University of Southern California's collections. Part of a weirder story, if some of you went to Nathan Ty's talk on Henry Chung, who was the first Korean student at what is now UNK, graduated from the normal school in like 1907, 1908, and went on to be involved in kind of Korean politics and be involved in the political founding of what is the modern state of South Korea. He's a student here in Kearney in the early 1900s, and actually in Rosina's letter, I didn't highlight it, but it's another passage in the letter, She says she remembers when Eliza and that Korean boy were working at houses in town. That Korean boy is Henry Chung, who's one of the founders of South Korea. And this photograph of Eliza is in the Henry Chung papers at USC. So Dr. Tai was doing some research into Henry Chung as part of preparing a brown bag and stumbled across this photograph that presumably was in his personal private collection of photographs of a woman he had worked with. So again, she has a much more interesting life when you start piecing that together, right? She worked alongside a guy who goes on to be involved in Korean politics. Yeah.
I grew up in Hastings, many years ago, and then I came to UNK. And I always mentioned to my mother, why there weren't a number of Negroes in Kearney, where there was many, many Negroes in Hastings. And when I came to Kearney, I thought the only actual Negro in Kearney was a barber.
When did you come to Kearney?
Had a barber down, I think on Second
Mr.
Avenue.
Green, I think his name was Green.
His name was Green.
Yeah. So, I mean,
When she was talking about fleeing, but yet she is married here and all the other
folks are
families
leaving.
left.
Yeah. And by all indications, when she dies, and I haven't definitively confirmed this, but when she dies, it is reported in the papers that she's the only African-American person living in Kearney at that point. And so there are no black folks in Kearney for a little bit after her passing. The next kind of wave of African-Americans in the community would come with World War II, the service members who were at the Air Force Base. And that's when the community institutes some segregation. There's some segregated bars and things for African-American service members. There's a lot of unrest in the community in the 40s over the presence of black service members here. And then more folks kind of, once you get to the 70s and 80s, you start seeing more waves of immigrants coming into Kearney, people moving to Kearney, and that community starting to grow again. But it does, based on the record, seem like this community that she had been a part of kind of disappears, and then a new community crops up later on. Hastings, however, has a much longer history of an African-American presence. Actually, Hastings has the first black-owned newspaper in the state. It's published in like 1874, 1875, something like that. It's called the Western Post. It was a Hastings newspaper produced by a black individual in Hastings for just a couple years, but it's the first black newspaper in Nebraska, black-owned newspaper in Nebraska. Long before she shows up.
Why were they called normal schools?
So normal schools were teacher education schools. Yeah, so I don't honestly remember why the word normal is used in that one. But normal schools were schools for, primarily for teacher education, teacher training.
My mom went to one.
Yeah.
In Shad.
Yep, yes, yeah. Yeah, they typically serve just kind of the immediate surrounding population, training folks to go out.
I've never asked the question why they were called normal.
Yeah. Yeah, and lots of normal schools were around. Arizona State University, which is my alma mater, was originally Tempe Normal School.
Thank you so much. I think we'll wrap up officially. If anybody wants to hang out and ask some more questions, you're more than welcome to, but thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.